I mean, remember what we had talked about earlier in this chapter? We had said, I believe it was just yesterday's lesson, where you had to have a willing public to fight this war. It was why we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, you start throwing a combined, whatever, 35 million casualties or whatever it is, a ridiculous number of dead and wounded, into this small continent of Europe. I mean, because really that's what we're talking about. We're talking about in this one region, I mean, a very small region, we're talking about the deaths of and casualties of woundings of some 35 million people. That's unbelievable, especially in only 4 years. And that willing public that nations had to fight these wars, that willing public is going to go away. So while nations definitely thought they could have victory, remember, as what we said yesterday, you're only going to get that if you have a willing public. And by 1917, 1918, a lot of these nations didn't. And the proof is in the pudding, because in all of those central powers, whether it's going to be the Russian, whether it's going to be the Austrian, Hungarian Empire, or the German Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, you're going to see revolutions break out. In each of these countries, revolutions emerge. And they're not the only places either that have revolutions. The Russian Empire goes through its own revolution as well. All of these empires that were fighting this war experienced dramatic revolution. The Kaiser, the emperor in Germany, is overthrown. The emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is overthrown. The caliph of the Ottoman Empire is overthrown. The Tsar, or the leader of the Russian Empire, is overthrown. And all of these empires are going to find themselves collapsing. Let me show you what I mean. I'll give you a case example here. The case example we're going to use is going to be Russia. Because you can see here this bullet that says Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, overthrew the Russian government and established a new communist government. So we want to see what that looks like and how does that work. Communist governments being dictatorships where the government controls everything. So just really kind of quick to show you this case example, this kind of case study of what happens when you lose a willing public. Here is Russia before World War I. And really, this is actually an unfair representation of Russia, because there's actually more political parties than just these two. So you have the Russian Empire. It's led by an emperor. It's called the Tsar. That's the emperor. That's kind of like the Caesar in the Roman Empire, or the Kaiser in the German Empire. But Russia had a lot of political parties, and that was normal of most of these empires. A lot of them had many different political parties. That's not particularly unusual. So you have, for example, the Octoberists, which is a political party. You have the Bolsheviks that are a political party. And each of these groups want different things. Like, for example, the Octoberists wanted democracy, and the Bolsheviks wanted communism. Remember, communism is a type of dictatorship where the government will control everything. And so as the willing public in World War I begins to lose its willingness to fight in World War I, revolution will break out, and fighting actually begins between different groups of people. So you actually see, for example, in the case of Russia, you're going to see the Bolsheviks fighting the Tsar's forces, and the Octoberists fighting the Tsar's forces, and even the Bolshevists and the Octoberists fighting each other. Everyone is clamoring for a piece of the power. And when peace is finally settled, and it takes quite some time, when peace is finally settled, what you end up with is a new country. The Russian Empire is gone. And in its place is the Bolshevik Party. Just one Bolshevik Party, or Communist Party, which controls everything. They control the economy. They determine what your freedoms are or aren't. In this case, there are no freedoms. They control everything in this dictatorship. And here's the trick. Everyone is to be treated equally. It doesn't matter if you're a prince or a princess or the poorest worker in the poorest town in all of the Soviet Union, what used to be the Russian Empire, you will be treated equally. So this is just one example of what happens in one country as these revolutions strike these World War I powers, pushing and fighting to try and change the system that dragged them into this death machine of World War I. By November 11th of 1918, these nations are exhausted. Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, which is pulled out of the war, the Ottoman Empire. These nations are exhausted and they sign an armistice. Please note this is a truce. An armistice is a truce. It's not a peace treaty. That has to be negotiated after the fact. So we've got this temporary lull in fighting, and everyone's going to go to Paris, France. And in Paris, France, they're going to begin negotiating a treaty. And that treaty is called, eventually, the Treaty of Versailles. And everyone comes to the table with different ideas. Like, so for example, President Wilson says, you know what, I want to take a look at all these different reasons that nations went to war. I mean, we could rattle them all off, right? We saw ideas in the unification of Germany. We saw arms races. We saw self-determination. We saw crises like the issues with submarines and the sinking of the Lusitania or the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. We saw laws passed to keep people willing. And President Wilson in 1918 is going to go to Versailles and he's going to say, we have to do something about that. We have to put in place a plan that's going to delete those different reasons for war. And President Wilson's going to call his plan the 14 points. He says, let's get rid of arms races. Let's get rid of fighting over the seas like with submarines. Let's get rid of self-determination. Let's give everyone their own place. If we do this, then we'll have no more future war. But the other nations of Europe aren't interested in that because that's too fair. That doesn't punish anybody, right? Because what you have here are nations that are crumbling. The German Empire crumbled. Austro-Hungarian Empire is crumbling. Ottoman Empire crumbling. Russian Empire crumbling. France, Great Britain, millions upon millions upon millions of dead and wounded soldiers. Who gets punished for this terrible catastrophe? Someone must be punished. Who will pay? And so they reject President Wilson's 14 points. They reject the idea of putting an end to the causes of war. And instead they look to blame someone. And in the case of World War I, they force Germany to admit its guilt. And they say, Germany, you did this. You're responsible. You killed more than any other. You must pay. Figuratively and literally. They forced Germany to pay billions and billions, $55 billion of reparations in 1918. That's trillions of dollars in today's money. Germany, if you remember, didn't even declare war first. That was Austria-Hungary. Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary. But you want to punish the person who killed the most? You want to make them pay? Then you make the Germans pay. And so what we end up seeing here then as World War I comes to a close is this Treaty of Versailles, which fails to deal with any of the causes of war. And it fails to treat nations equally as they exit this war, many of them in turmoil. And instead, it forces Germany to admit guilt to a war it didn't necessarily cause, and it forces Germany to pay a tremendous amount of reparations as damages, money to be paid to the winners as damages over the next 20, 30, 40 years. This is going to leave a terribly bitter, bitter taste, an angry taste in Germany's mouth. An angry taste that someone named Adolf Hitler will capitalize on in the 1920s and 1930s. The last point here is that the world changes as a result of World War I. What had been formerly empires of World War I are gone. And you can see here what I mean. Germany has lost a good chunk of land. You can see any area that I'll color in red has been lost to Germany. Poof, gone. You can see that the Russian Empire has lost a tremendous amount of land. It loses land that's called here as Romania. It loses all of this land of Poland. It loses Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. You can see that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is carved up into countries like Austria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the rest of Romania and Yugoslavia. All of these countries are carved up. All of these countries are created out of the fallen empires of the world. Even Turkey is a new country which emerges from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And an attempt to welcome and to help all of these new nations handle the pressures of international relations and the existence of their countries, in many cases for the first time in centuries, a new League of Nations is created. A group of nations that together are supposed to stop this kind of tragedy from happening again. But the Senate in America is going to look at this and say, that doesn't work. You didn't deal with any of the root causes of war. You might have created a group to try and prevent a war, but you didn't deal with any of the root causes when you could have. And you create all these new countries. You force Germany to pay. You cripple it. This isn't going to end well. So America refuses to sign the Treaty of Versailles, hoping to keep itself free of foreign entanglements. And we'll see how that plays out in upcoming chapters as we approach the 1920s and the 1930s and even World War II.